Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Leap of Faith with Penina Taylor.
Hi, and welcome back to Leap of Faith. I'm Penina Taylor, and I'm really excited to be here with you today. Joining me is my guest, Shannon Nuszen, who has had a fascinating journey to Judaism. Shannon was raised a preacher's kid. She's a former missionary and an ordained minister herself who converted to Judaism and is now living in Israel in the Judean hills. Welcome, Shannon, to Leap of Faith.
Hi, Penina. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. I've been wanting to do this for some time, as you know, so I'm very excited to have you. So, Shannon, I always like to start our conversations at the very beginning. So why don't you tell us a little bit about how you grew up?
Okay, the beginning is a good place. I don't have any big story of how I came to evangelical Christianity. I was actually born into it.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, my mother likes to tell people that I was speaking in tongues before I could walk. She has this story she tells people of how I would go banging up and down the hallway in my walker with my eyes closed, my hands up in the air, and babbling gibberish at the top of my lungs. Of course, I was imitating my father, who at the time was a newly ordained Assembly of God minister.
Right. So just for those who might not know, the Assembly of God Church is part of an evangelical grouping that we call the charismatic churches, where there's a lot more emotion involved in the worship.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Something about me, I can be described as zealous at times. I prefer the word passionate. When I put my head to something, I tend to go all in. So even though that I say I didn't have a choice in being a Christian, I did go all in. As a preacher's kid, when the doors of the church were open, I was there. I was in the youth programs, something called missionettes, which is like Christian Girl Scouts. I went to mission trips, summer camps, preacher's kids retreats, all of that. I basically lived in the church and was fully immersed and dedicated to living a good Christian lifestyle.
That doesn't always happen, though, does it? A lot of times preachers' kids are under so much pressure, being in the limelight or having very strong expectations on them, that they don't always toe the line, so to speak. But you did.
I did, but as you can imagine, that wasn't so easy as a teenager. There was always a big push in the church to be missionaries to our peers. And I was good at it because I had no problem inviting students to programs with the goal of getting them to accept Jesus. That, of course, made me weird in school. I managed it pretty well, though, because the church teaches this psychological mindset that probably seems awkward to Jewish listeners. The Christian Bible refers to persecution as a great sign of faith. So the more you're persecuted, the more faith you must have, and therefore God is more pleased with you.
Right.
So when I would wear my Jesus shirts, or I would carry my Bible to school, or I did studies during my lunch break, I was called Bible Thumper, which didn't bother me. It just made me more proud. I wore it like a badge of honor because to me, my faith was everything. It wasn't all for show. I studied my Bible during our lunch hour because I had to. I had my father. He was a very strict man. He was not only a preacher, but he was a very military man. He was a drill sergeant, in fact. He later went into law enforcement, which was his day job.
Mm-hmm.
And it's one of the things I think I'm thankful for, looking back. My father did push us to think independently and learn things for ourselves. So I was the oldest out of 5. And each week we had to come up with what Jews would call a Devar Torah, except my father wouldn't allow us to use any ready-made references. Like today I would go to the internet, or I would choose something from the Torah tidbits for inspiration, but that didn't work with my dad. Whatever subject we picked, we had to research it ourselves. We weren't allowed to state an opinion or have an argument that was based on what somebody else had said. We had to have thoroughly researched the subject and be able to quote those sources.
Interesting. So were you were able to refer, though, to like church fathers and other important Christian scholars, right?
Yes, but we had to quote those sources. It couldn't be just something we heard somebody else spout. We needed to know it for ourselves. Where did that come from?
Great. So did this translate to the ability to ask questions, or was that something that was kind of shied upon, like, you don't ask those questions if you have real faith?
That came about later
Mm-hmm.
in my learning. I did learn to question later. I'll get into that in a minute. But
Sure.
along the way, my parents divorced. My father was unable to keep his ordination with the Assemblies of God, and he went back to seminary, became an ordained minister with the non-denominational church, pastored his own non-denominational church, which was just as evangelical as anything else we had ever been to. And my mom started going to her own church, which was messianic Judaism. It was an Assemblies of God church that was morphing into messianic Judaism.
Okay.
And it was through that church with my mother that I learned the various Jewish traditions. What interests me was learning the meaning behind a lot of the traditions. I still love that. I like learning all of those little things that we do that we're not sure why we do it. And then when you learn the meaning behind it, it's like really deep and inspirational.
Yeah.
That was what drew me originally. Of course, once again, even in that church, there was a strong pull to evangelize.
Right.
But this time, it wasn't to everybody, but specifically to the Jews. So I had been trained as a missionary before, but becoming a missionary to the Jews was much more intense.
Right. A little
And
scarier too.
well, it's because Jews, even the secular ones, know the Bible. Of course, Jews completely reject the New Testament. So the technique to getting a Jew to accept Christianity is to show them how Jesus was in fact the Messiah through their own Bible,
Right.
which to me at the time was the Old Testament.
Right.
This new way of missionizing was challenging, and anybody who knows me knows that that's kind of like waving a red flag in front of a bull. I was up for the challenge, and I went all in on this as well. As I got started in my training, everything took on a new meaning. It wasn't just a challenge anymore, but I fell in love with the Jewish people. And it was a very deep and sincere love. And I think everybody's probably met one of these kind of people before. They're the
Yeah.
kind of Christians that are really sweet. They're very sincere, and they would do anything for you just because you're a Jew.
Right.
We have a problem in Israel now. We have big Christian organizations that are here, and they're dedicated to fulfilling every need of every Jew. And that's not fake. It's something that I think everybody should understand about Christians. They're not bad people, and it's not, the act of converting itself is not from an evil place. I think you go into it in one of the speeches I've heard you give.
Yeah.
Is that it's really out of love, and it's a very sincere and deep love that they feel is inspired by God.
I think that's an important point that you bring up, not only because the Jewish people need to understand that while we disagree with, Christians are not bad people, and they're not coming at missionizing with the purpose of destroying the Jewish soul, as we put it. They just want to share what they believe to be God's love with the Jewish people, because they love the Jewish people because of the fact that we were chosen by God. The problem we have sometimes, I think, and I do mention this in several talks that I give, is that when we as Jewish people train our children to see missionaries as these big bad monsters, which in some ways in our own minds they are, but we paint this picture of these big bad monsters, these bad people. And then when our children come in contact with someone who is trying to missionize them, instead of being prepared and maybe having a couple of good explanations that they've learned, things that they can share, comebacks or whatever, instead they're just flabbergasted by the sincerity that they were not prepared for.
Right, exactly. And it's an intense love. Unfortunately, it's that deep love for God's chosen people that brings about their passion to do whatever it takes to get you to accept Jesus. You also, in one of your speeches, I heard you describe it as watching somebody in a burning building that doesn't know that the house is burning. In Christianity, we're taught that Jews that don't accept Jesus are going to suffer this eternal damnation and hell and lake of fire and lots of scary stuff. Right. So for somebody who's learned to love the Jews so passionately, it's very concerning, and it becomes a passion and an obsession out of love to save these people that they love.
Right, exactly.
Anyway, so that's where I was. I was committed to learning about how to bring Jews to Jesus and saving God's chosen people from this terrible fate that they were facing. And the way to do that was to know the Old Testament proofs that Jesus was the Messiah. So I did that. I have a knack for memorization, and so I had every reference memorized. And they have it all mapped out for you now on a reference chart. There's one side has the Old Testament prophecies, and the other side has the New Testament fulfillment.
Right.
Once I'd memorized the whole chart, to me, it was absolutely clear that Jesus was, in fact, the Messiah that was mentioned over and over again in the Old Testament. And in my mind, the only reason that a Jew would not accept that was because they were simply refusing to look at it. It just seemed that clear. Unfortunately, just as I was successful in mainstream missionary work, I was also successful in this new technique as well. Many secular Jews, even Israelis, are in the church today because of me. At the time, I was very proud of that because converting a Jew, status-wise, earns you a big gold star in the Christian world.
Right.
Of course, today, thinking about that hurts very much.
Right. Okay, Shannon, unfortunately, I have to stop you right now because we are out of time for this segment. So we have to take a short break. But when we come back, we'll continue our fascinating conversation with my guest, Shannon Nuszen. You are listening to Leap of Faith. I'm Penina Taylor, and we'll be right back.
Shalom, everybody. Making a difference often takes just one moment and one person at a time. I am Beyneynu Davis, your show host on Israel News Talk Radios from Jerusalem with Love. You'll be hearing people talking about politics, religion, social issues, and making a better tomorrow. Join me, Beyneynu Davis, for God and Country. From Jerusalem with Love.
Wednesdays on Israel News Talk Radio.
Leap of Faith with Penina Taylor.
Hi, and welcome back to the second segment of Leap of Faith. I'm your host, Penina Taylor, and today I'm speaking with Shannon Nuszen, who is sharing her journey from ordained minister and missionary to Torah Judaism. Now, before the break, Shannon was telling us about how she happened to have a unique knack for sharing the gospel with the Jewish people. And so she was responsible for bringing many, many Jewish people to Christianity. All right, Shannon, so what happened after that?
I was successful with secular Jews, people who weren't so affiliated. They did know the Bible, but my biggest problem came about when I would encounter more religious Jews, because religious Jews seemed to have they had cue cards that they had already in their head. They were ready to answer me, and sometimes they'd even get excited to engage me. They were ready for the taunting, and they would answer me saying I didn't know what I was talking about, that the Hebrew is actually different, that my translations are all wrong, or that you're taking verses out of context, and I didn't know how to respond to those. So clearly, if I was going to be able to reach a religious Jew, I was really going to have to know my stuff, and memorizing the verses that I had memorized just wasn't enough. So after encountering a few of those types of Jews, I was more determined than ever. So I went back to work studying, and I went back to that same prophecy fulfillment chart. But this time I had decided that I'm not going to just memorize the verse. I'm going to memorize the whole chapter. And if I have to, I'm going to memorize the whole book. I was just determined to make it happen. And that's where my life took a really dramatic turn, because my mission to understand more just seemed to make me more confused, and I felt more and more stupid the more I was learning. And suddenly just nothing made sense. It was like my brain just went kaput. I was understanding what I was reading. I understood exactly what it was saying, but I wasn't able to make the connections anymore, and it became very foggy. I couldn't figure out, once I read everything, how those were fulfillments of prophecy. So I went to my pastor. I went to various teachers with my problem, and we'd go through it together. And
Mhm.
apparently they were still seeing it just as clear as I was before. I just still wasn't getting it. So I kept getting the same answer over and over again with all of my questions. And that was, it doesn't have to make sense. You just lack faith.
Right.
And that was offensive to me. That hurt a lot to hear, because I lived and breathed my faith. I was in the doors of the church every time it was open. I woke up with my mission for the day, which had something to do with bringing people to Jesus. So to tell me that I lacked faith, that was horrific. I didn't lack faith. I might not understand something at the moment, but I don't lack faith.
Right.
That was unshakable.
Right.
So to make a long story short, I found a website which seemed to be those religious Jews' cue cards.
Aha.
My original plan was, if it doesn't make sense to me, I'm going to have to learn how to debate these people. And when I found their cue cards, this website of answering Christian missionaries, I thought I had it made. I found the gold mine, that I was just going to learn what their responses were, and I'll just learn how to properly debate them, and I'll convert them that way.
Mm-hmm. I say that with a knowing, because that's what my dad tried to do after I came back to Judaism. And I'm suspecting, I don't want to jump in on your story, but I'm suspecting that, like my dad, you discovered some things along the way.
Yes, that is actually where my life truly fell apart, because it wasn't my lack of faith that was the problem. It was the fact that I didn't know at the time. I felt stupid, but the real reason was that I was learning too much, because when you put the verses and you use them in context with the rest of the chapter or the rest of the book, it no longer takes on the meaning that I had been taught that it did.
Right.
So after I went through each and every one of them, because I thought, that's just one that they got me on, but it was everyone, one right after another. They just kept falling apart. And they were right. They were either taken out of context, they were mistranslated, or sometimes they were just flat out completely made up out of the blue.
Right.
At that point, I think I went through every stage of grief, which it started with intense sadness, because what was central in my life just no longer existed. And to know that everything was a lie was infuriating. It was intense anger, because I had believed that my Bible was the living, breathing Word of God, and there wasn't any mistakes in it. So when I learned that those texts were being used deceptively, or that they were purposely changed, or they were mistranslated, there was an agenda, that infuriated me.
Mm-hmm.
And then suddenly there's no God in your life,
Right.
which leads to a very helpless and hopeless state of being. I would cry uncontrollably in pure mental agony. And anybody who's been in that state, when you're in that state and there's no God, who do you cry out to?
Right.
It's a really bad, dangerous place to be.
Yeah. And like for us, I didn't go through the there is no God stage, because for whatever reason, that was a given. Even though everything else I believed was a lie, the existence of God was a given. What my husband expresses in his journey was feeling betrayed by God. And that's also a pretty difficult place to be.
That's interesting, betrayed by God, because I guess my feeling was I was betrayed by the church and this lie that I had been given.
Yeah.
I didn't necessarily put it to God.
Right. Yeah. But it is interesting to look at how each of us deals with that moment of grieving, as you say, when we suddenly realize that everything we've believed for however long was a lie. And then we each have to kind of deal with it differently.
Psychologists refer to it as a major life change, which is equivalent to losing a spouse or a significant loved one. And that's really exactly what it is, because even though Jesus was basically an imaginary friend. It's somebody who I'd had daily conversations with and had been one with me since I was a child.
Right.
So it was somebody who meant everything to me, and my entire life revolved around. So all of a sudden that's gone, and you're left with a very empty feeling. There's nothing for you to do because your whole life revolved around going to church. There's nowhere for you to go. Your friends completely abandon you because you learn real quick that Christian love is not as unconditional as they say it is.
Right.
There's no significance in your life. There's no purpose. And it's a very difficult place for anybody who's gone through this.
Yeah, totally. So then what did you do?
Your connection of knowing that God was there, I didn't quite make that connection at first. And it wasn't until I spoke directly to one of the rabbis that teach this. My biggest problem was that, to me, Jesus and God were always one person. Even though Christianity teaches that there are three different personalities, the Father, the Son, the Holy Ghost, one can't exist without the other, which is also why Christians don't understand why that's idolatry.
Right.
I'd had a hard time coming to terms with the fact that Jesus may or may not have existed at all. I did a little journey of figuring out, okay, if he wasn't the Messiah, then who was he? And I need to know the truth. Who was he? What did he do? But this rabbi gently explained to me that I was just trying to find a proper file to put Jesus into, and I wasn't able to do that as neatly as I felt I needed to. And if he wasn't the Messiah, then the rest is irrelevant. It doesn't really matter who he was or if he even existed at all.
Right. Yeah.
And once you make that connection and that clicks, you can let it go, which was where I got from there. Because once I was told that God was still there and that he loved me, and that all I had discovered was that there's no need for a middleman anymore, that I can go directly to God. From that moment on, I decided I was only going to learn what was true. I'm going to go back to the original Tanakh. I'm going to go back to the Hebrew as much as I could. I don't speak Hebrew, but I was going to learn it. And in a lot of ways, that took a lot of unlearning first. When I learn Tanakh now, without the Christian theology built into it, it's so pure and so refreshing and so different from what I had ever experienced before. Because in Christianity, the deeper you delve into learning, the more confusing it gets, and the more you have to engage and really pay attention, because things just start to fall apart, and it doesn't make sense the deeper you get into it. And the deeper you learn Torah, the more clarity you get, and the more it begins to make sense.
Right. Absolutely. It's really interesting. One time I was at a conference. I was actually at the Isha Torah Partners Conference. I was speaking, and a Christian couple walked into the hotel. And the young woman who was greeting saw me and said, "Oh, Penina, you need to speak to these people." So she introduces me to this couple. They don't know who I am. They don't know my background, my history, or anything like that. And they start talking about, how they were Christians and how excited they were to be there, and the fact that they were learning Hebrew at a Jewish congregation. And so I just looked at them and I said, that is really wonderful. Just be careful, because you may discover, once you start looking at scriptures in the original Hebrew, you may discover that what you thought things meant don't actually mean that. And you're like, oh, okay.
That's a difficult topic I'm asked about a lot, especially from personal friends and family that are still in Christianity. And I'm still not able to come up with the right answer, or an answer that I'm comfortable with, because this whole journey, it really does destroy families. It tears apart families, and it's hard to say that it's right to do that.
Yeah. Okay, Shannon.
I'm still not comfortable with it.
Yeah, I understand. Unfortunately, I have to stop you again. We're at the end of the second segment, but when we come back, we will hear the rest of Shannon's amazing story. You're listening to Leap of Faith. I'm Penina Taylor, and we'll be right back.
You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio. This is Shai Bentikoa, and each week I'll be webcasting to you from Judea, origin of the word Jew, a people besieged and beleaguered in every generation. Nazi Germany's but a memory, but in its place the world invented the phantom Palestinians as this generation's internationally authorized Jew killers. Tune in for a different slant on life in Israel, Phantom Nation, every Monday.
Hi, I'm Rabbi David Aaron. The soul basics are the most profound, the most essential, and yet often the most neglected in our education. Join me for Soul Talk on Israel's News Talk Radio and discover the secrets to love, spiritual growth, and personal power.
Leap of Faith with Penina Taylor.
Hi, and welcome back to the last segment of today's Leap of Faith. I'm your host, Penina Taylor, and today I am speaking with Shannon Nuszen, who is sharing her incredible journey from ordained minister and missionary to Torah Judaism. And before the break, Shannon was telling us about how she had reached this absolutely critical place in her journey. All right, Shannon, let's take it from there.
I wanted to tell you, one of the things I think is really important with this series that you're doing on people's journeys, just like we talked about, as you dig into Christianity, it becomes more and more confusing. And the opposite, when you learn Torah, it becomes more and more clear. With these stories, I'm sure you're noticing, and I wanted to ask your listeners to listen and notice as well, that there's something very important that sticks out in these stories. And we have Jews who convert out to Christianity, and we have Christians who convert to Judaism. But there's a significant difference in both of them, and that is when a Jew converts to Christianity, it is almost always an emotional decision. It always follows some sort of crisis or hitting rock bottom, and they find Christianity when they have reached the absolute lowest state of their life. And I found the opposite when Christians find Judaism. When I listen to these stories, almost always it's an intellectual decision that comes at a time where the person felt extremely learned. They knew what they were talking about. They were at the top of their game. They were confident in their faith. It was unshakable. So I'm not a psychologist, but that just hearing that in the stories, that speaks strongly to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very important point, I think, that you make.
And the other thing was when I go to families for Shabbat and I see the youngest children giving a Devar Torah at the table, I realize I thought I was very learned. And at 28 years old, when I discovered this, it was a really big blow to realize that I knew absolutely nothing. And I truly envy being at a Shabbos table where the youngest children can give a Devar Torah and they learn Torah and they know truth from a young age. And I don't think Jews fully comprehend that gift that they're given to be raised in such truth and such purity, because there's no theology, there's no agendas. It's just the simple truth that God made us, we're his people, and he loves us. He led us out of the desert.
Right.
And despite all of our flaws, he continues to keep his promises to Israel, and that is inspiring to me.
It's huge. Okay, so what happened after, you started studying and you realized that there was a problem, but that doesn't mean that you're going to convert to Judaism. How did you make that leap?
I think as you learn more Torah and you learn it from such a pure place, there's a need for community, a need to latch on to God's people.
Mm-hmm. Did anybody ever offer you the option of being a Noahide, for example, or was that something that you just couldn't consider?
Yes. In fact, people come to me and ask for advice now, and I never tell them that they should convert. I always tell them there's no need to convert.
Right.
It is totally okay to put that aside and be a Noahide, a righteous Gentile. There's so many terms for it today. But there's no need to convert to Judaism. You can totally go through the McDonald's drive-thru and be okay.
Right. That's something I think that people don't realize, is that it's much better for somebody to stay a non-Jew who keeps the 7 laws of Noah than to convert to Judaism and then decide it's not for them in the end, because what they're doing is turning what wasn't a sin into a sin, both for them and for the Jewish people. And so, but so you said that you were offered that as an option?
I was, and I do understand why people struggle in that phase. There isn't really anything available for the righteous Gentiles that have come out of the church, because like we talked about, that's central and that's the central focus of your life. And then all of a sudden there's no religion, and it's enough to just believe in God, and you lose your community and everything that once your life revolved around. It's very difficult to fill that with something else.
Yeah.
I tell people to somehow find a social outlet. You do need to fill that need for social interaction and community, and to feel like you have a place.
Right. Fortunately, nowadays, things are a little bit better. There are some Noahide communities that are not only being created, but growing, especially in Texas. And there's, of course, a tremendous amount available online. But okay, so then what happened? You decided to pursue conversion.
I decided to pursue conversion. I was very attracted to the value system of Orthodox Judaism, the intense focus on family, Shabbat. Shabbat is something like gefilte fish. You can't explain it until you've been there.
I still can't explain gefilte fish.
But being able to, people say, oh my gosh, how do you do that? How do you go completely unconnected and doing nothing on Shabbat, which is not true. Any woman who has known Shabbat knows that you work 10 times harder on Shabbat than you do any other day of the week.
Yeah.
And that's not what it's about. But it's a focus on your family. It's a focus on Hashem, and going to the synagogue and praying and spending a whole day just focusing on the parsha for the week and learning and being with your family. It's unique. And I think Shabbat was probably what mostly drew me in. And the traditions, a strong need for traditions and family. And I learned all the mitzvot and the traditions. And to me, it's like an opportunity to thank Hashem over and over again with just the basic actions, to give a kiss to God and say thank you for what you've done for me.
Lovely. Okay, so where did you convert? Where were you living at this time? I didn't even ask you where you were.
I was in Houston, Texas. I had 2 children. My youngest at the time was considered under my conversion because he was 4, and my oldest eventually did as she was 12. She was post bat mitzvah, so she actually had to have her own Beit Din and make her own decision.
And she did.
Okay. And then I got married. We got married in Hebron.
Very cool.
And now we made Aliyah. We live in the Judean hills. It's beautiful.
Yes, it is.
And this journey for truth seems to have followed me. Judaism talks about a sort of reincarnation of past lives and making a tikkun, and that each time we come back, there's some sort of tikkun. And I really feel that somehow my tikkun is to expose truth, because that seems to be like the repeating thing in my life.
Yeah, that it's very interesting. You kind of touched on this a few minutes back, that those of us who have made the journey from Christianity to Judaism have done so because we desperately want the truth. And like you say, that translates into every area of your life. So now you've been doing a lot having to do with trying to communicate the truths about the land of Israel to the rest of the world, right?
Yes, because when you hear the media, when you hear how Israel is portrayed to the rest of the world, it is so opposite of what's reality on the ground. So a lot of your listeners probably follow a lot of the personalities that live out here in Judea and Samaria, telling people this is what's actually going on, and countering what you're seeing in the media when you go to see what they call settlements out in the West Bank. It's not caravans hanging off the side of a hill. We have beautiful homes out here in the Judean hills that people can't imagine exist. It's not at all what you see. We host seminary girls all the time in our home, and I ask them where they've been and what they've experienced through their year in Israel, and they said, well, we're allowed to go everywhere except the West Bank, which I laugh because they don't realize when they're being hosted in my home that we are in the West Bank.
Right.
But It's gorgeous, it's beautiful, and you feel so much peace when you're in Israel. Anybody who's visited Israel, I don't think you've ever heard anybody say or describe Israel as a unsafe, war-torn country that is portrayed in the media.
Right. Okay. Well, Shannon, we are just about out of time for today's program. Is there anything that you would like to tell others who might be listening and perhaps are finding themselves in a similar place to somewhere that you were along your journey?
To seek truth with everything you have and do what feels right to you. The righteous Gentile route wasn't right for me, so I chose Orthodox Judaism, but it has to be done with an open mind to understand that there's ugliness everywhere, even within the Jewish community, and not to make those decisions because there's of some fantasy that everything is wonderful and beautiful in the Jewish world, because
it's made with humans.
Right.
Yeah.
And
exactly.
and we're not doing this for humans and for people. We're doing it because of truth, and we value and love what's taught.
Okay. Thank you so much, Shannon. It's been a real joy to talk with you and to hear your journey. And we're about to say goodbye. But if someone identified with what you said today and would like to get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
I guess nowadays it's social media that's the best way.
Okay.
I'm Shannon Nuszen, Nuszen, on Facebook. A lot of people find me that way.
Okay, great. So they should look you up on Facebook. And if they don't have Facebook, is there an email address to write to you at?
It is my name, ShannonNuszen, @gmail.com.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much again for joining me today, Shannon.
Thank you, Penina.
You've been listening to Leap of Faith. I'm Penina Taylor, and I'd love to hear from you as well. So thanks again for being here with me today, and I'll see you next time when we take a leap of faith together here on Israel News Talk Radio.